Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming today. As you probably know, I'm not a polished preacher, but not to brag, John, but I've got people from Belize that just came in to see this. But just bear with me today. I'm not super polished, but hopefully you'll find this an interesting topic, as I do for sure. I'm not sure which button to push. There we go. Today's topic is on Solomon's temple, and I think it's really important in our lives today, just how symbolic this temple was. And in researching this and putting this together, it can go really deep. I'm sure a lot of you know that. It can go deep politically, it can go deep religiously, lots of feelings on a lot of different sides, but I'm taking the perspective today of the Christian viewpoint. And if there's any errors you hear today, just feel free to yell mean things at me in the parking lot later if you want, that's fine. That's exactly what I like. To get started today is a little timeline of the temple, and again at the end I'll bring this all together, but the point of this slide, it's kind of rough. It's not to learn every detail, but to kind of show you the timeline of the temporary tabernacle, the first temple and the second temple, and kind of the timelines at the bottom show you there. And then on the right you see where Jesus was at the second temple, at the very end of it, of the existence of that. So we'll go into a little bit of detail here. The first tabernacle was Moses' tabernacle, and it was used for about 500 years. And it moved with the Jews as they moved around. And then the first temple was completed in 957 BC and lasted for about 400 years. And this is the temple that contained the Ark of the Covenant and some other religious artifacts that were there. And while that temple existed, almost half of the Old Testament took place while it stood. And this was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon when he conquered Jerusalem and took all the Jews hostage at that point. And there's very scant remains of that temple today. There's a few, they think, maybe, but there are some remaining, but not very much. The second temple was completed by 515 BC, and it was rebuilt on the first ruins, and we know that from Ezra 6:3, that it was built on those ruins. And it was enlarged some years later by King Herod, and it's often why it's called Herod's temple, is because he did a very grand renovation of it and made it much larger. And this was the temple that Jesus walked. And that's why I think this is important. There's a lot of teachings by Jesus that relate to this temple and how it relates to the coming new covenant that he brought about. But the second temple did not contain any of the ritual objects from the Ark, like the Ark of the Covenant. And some of this, the second temple remains, like the Wailing Wall that you might be familiar with. Although that term, they don't like to use that term much. It's the Western Wall in Jerusalem, and I'll show you some pictures of it here. This was destroyed by Titus and the Romans in 70 AD. This is the Wailing Wall that you're probably familiar with, or the Western Wall. It's a remnant, of the second temple. And the reason this is important to Jews there is it's closest to the Holy of Holies, which is where the temple was. This is the closest they can get to it in modern times. And one of the things of the prophecy of Jesus here, he predicted this in 3 of the 4 Gospels, the destruction of that second temple. And I think this is important because it's a modern visual display of what is actually there and the prophecy that actually took place. And in Luke 21:5, he says, "Then as some spoke of the temple, how it was adorned with beautiful stones and donations, he said, 'These things which you see, the days will come, which not one stone shall be left upon another, that shall not be thrown down.'" I don't think that refers in any way to that Wailing Wall. I think it's clear in Mark 12:2 that he says, "You see these great buildings, not one stone will be left upon another, which will not be torn down." And there you have visual evidence of that prophecy coming true for the Second Temple. In modern times, there's Muslims built a mosque on it in 688 AD. It's called the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and it stands there today. This is the peak of Mount Moriah, which is believed to be located under the rock, the Dome of the Rock. We can't say 100% for sure, but it's almost certain that this is the peak of Mount Moriah. And around the foundation of this is where King Herod built the base, where the Wailing Wall is, because it's a peak, and they had to expand it as he expanded the temple, that King Herod did. And this is also an important spot religiously. There's a lot of foreshadowing about this place. Abraham was told in Genesis 2:22, "Now take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you." And this, again, foreshadows the sacrifice of a son at that spot. Instead, God provided a ram, which was sacrificed so that Isaac could live. And as we know, the entire Jewish line came from this line of Abraham. The lineage came from him. In that spot today is the foundation stone under that Dome of the Rock, the mosque that's there. It's believed to be where Isaac was bound. Again, we can't say for sure, but it's pretty likely it's become a hot spot politically, but we're pretty sure that's where it is, at least historically or through stories and Jewish texts. And another picture of that foundation stone. Part of the reason this site is so important is, well, I will get into that here in a minute. The location and construction of that first temple, again on Mount Moriah, it's a place of substitutional sacrifice. Abraham built his altar there to sacrifice Isaac. David also built an altar there to stop the plague on the Jews. Solomon built the first temple, and we built the second temple there. So it's a place of continual substitutional sacrifice. So it's a very important symbolic place, and that's obviously why they built the temple there. And the second temple, also when they built the second temple, Jesus' crucifixion wasn't far from there as well, which obviously was another substitutional sacrifice. King David captured Jerusalem in about 1000 BC. It was controlled by the Jebusites at the time. And David moved the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. And the temple, the first temple, was located between two valleys, the Central and the Kidron, and the mountain range between them is known as Mount Moriah. And the peak is a large protruding rock, that foundation stone that we talked about. According to Jewish tradition, the Garden of Eden was on a hill with a tree of life and a tree of good and evil. And when Adam and Eve were cast out, it was to the east. A flaming sword and cherubim were placed at the east entrance, and you had to enter the garden going west. And therefore, the tabernacle was also set up in this same orientation that we see in the Garden of Eden, possibly. Again, we're not 100% sure on that, but it's speculated that that's why the entrance was set up that way. And the tabernacle, this is the temporary tabernacle. It had three main areas: the outer court, the holy place, and the Holy of Holies. And King David began making preparations to replace the temporary temple. And that temporary temple lasted for over 400 years. And he was told by God, though, that he wasn't to build that temple. And in Chronicles 22, David said to Solomon, "My son, I had it in my heart to build a house for the name of the Lord my God. But this word of the Lord came to me. You have shed much blood and have fought many wars." Sorry, my contacts. You are not to build the house for my name, because you have shed much blood on the earth, in my sight, but you will have a son who will be a man of peace and rest, and I will give him rest from all his enemies on every side. His name will be Solomon, and I will grant Israel peace and quiet during his reign. He is the one who will build a house for my name. So David had amassed the supplies, but he was told by God that Solomon was to build the first temple. So Solomon was made king, and they began construction. And this is about 480 years after Israel left Egypt, and it was completed in 7 years. Now the temple that they built replicated the same layout, but it was much larger than the temporary temple was. It was most likely built, again, over the same protruding rock as Mount Moriah. And again, we don't know exactly what it looked like, but there's a lot of descriptions in the Bible, and hopefully some of the visuals you'll see here are interesting and can get you thinking about how important this temple was at the time. If you know that there were over 30,000 people that helped in the construction of the temple, it took what would have been the equivalent of millions and millions of dollars, and it was probably the most impressive building on the planet at the time, and it was covered in gold. You kind of begin to understand the importance of this, and it's also important to understand that this is how the Jews at the time were able to communicate with God, which was only directly through a priest, and we know that changes. There was cedar trees used in the construction of this, and I looked up the cedar trees. They came out of Lebanon, which was a spot in Lebanon, which was about 200 miles away. And if you can think about how impressive those trees, they're just beautiful trees. And the wood was used because it was very sturdy and didn't rot, and it was easy to shape, but it was hard to move. I can't imagine moving that much wood 200 miles without any automobiles or transportation. And some of the beams were so strong, they're not 100% certain because it's hard to examine the moss that's in there, but they're fairly certain that some of the beams from the first temple are still in use in that moss today. So it goes to the strength. But I just included this because I thought the trees were magnificent. Outside in the outer court was a brazen altar of sacrifice, and it was about 30 by 15 feet. There were horns on each corner, and this is where the animals were burnt as a sacrifice. Kind of, again, foreshadowing. Obviously, we know that the animal sacrifice is the foreshadowing of what was to come. And it was also a substitutional sacrifice for the sins of the Jews to sacrifice an animal, and therefore your sins are taken away. But it had to be done over and over again, and I can only imagine in this courtyard some of the activity going on at the time. There was a large brazen sea. I read somewhere it's about 10,000 gallons of seawater, and it had 12 oxen at the bottom representing the 12 tribes of Israel. And they use this to wash and cleanse everything. So we've got a little bit of foreshadowing there, such as in John 13:10, where Jesus told Peter, "One who is bathed only needs to wash his feet, but is clean." But here you had to clean the entire courtyard from the sacrifices that were taking place there. And also out in the outer court, there was water was poured into these 10 water carts and wheeled around to the courtyard for washing and cleansing by the priests. The storage for the building was on the southwest and north sides. It had 3 floors and chambers, and the entrance was on the south side, and it had wooden ladders in it. And this is where they think that many of the treasures of religious treasures of the time were stored. And in Matthew 6:19, we learn, "Do not lay up treasures for ourselves on earth, but in heaven." And at the front of the temple, there were in Kings 7, in King 7, we learn, then he set up the pillars by the vestibule of the temple. He set up the pillar on the right and called its name Jacquin, and he set up the pillar on the left and called its name Boaz. And the meanings of those two are in him and his strength, and it will establish at the front. In Revelations 3:12, we learn the pillars in the temple of God for those who remain faithful. Just tying in some verses that I think we get constant references to the temple, which I guess I really hadn't tied it together until I researched this a little bit and started finding that there's so much in the Bible that relates to this temple and foretelling of Jesus' sacrifice. That I think this is just important to me, and it really caught my attention. And these capitals on the top of the pillars were decorated with bronze lily flowers and petals and pomegranates. And the pomegranates were a sign of prosperity because of the many seeds that they had. And the robes of the priests also had pomegranates on it. And the main door, again, we don't know exactly what this looked like, but I hope this is a pretty close representation. The main door was a bifolding door, and it was covered in gold, and it had cherubim and gold flowers on it. The Bible describes the door frames as being a fourth part of the wall, and they believe it means it had 4 stepped door frames around it. The holy place, which could only be visited by priests, not the holy priest, but all priests could go in there, but no citizens. This was 45 feet tall, 60 feet long, and 30 feet wide. And everything, again, was covered in gold. And inside the holy place, again, this was only for priests inside of that. It was decorated with palm, cherubim, and flowers. And it's a possible reference to the Garden of Eden, and everything was in gold. I can't imagine the cost and construction of this must have been pretty impressive. It just shows you how important of a structure this was to everyone in the area, obviously. It was lit by 10 large menorahs, 5 on each side, and they were constantly burning. These menorahs had 7 lamps for 6 branches, probably speculating the 7 days of creation. And they used fresh olive oil in there, and they were never allowed to be lit outside of the temple, only inside of the temple. And it's different than the menorahs you see in people's houses today. Those are 9-branch Hanukkahs. I'm not sure why the difference is, but just a little bit of information there. And in John 9:5, we learn that as long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. So again, Jesus is kind of comparing himself to some of the symbolism we see. There were narrow windows at the top of each side to let the light in. And in John 6:48, Christ talks about being the light of the world and the bread of life. And there was 12 large breads inside, and they replenished that every Sabbath. Only the priests partook of the bread. And the entrance to the Holy of Holies had an incense altar, and this was similar to the altar of sacrifice outside, and they burned sweet incense to purify. I can imagine with a lot of the burning going on that there probably wasn't a very nice smell all the time. So the incense was used for purification. And in Revelations 8:4, we learn that prayers can be counted as incense before you. The door to the Holy of Holies had 5 door frames. And just outside of the Holy of Holies was a large, very large curtain. And before entering through the curtains, the red, blue, purple, and white curtains, they had cherubim on it. Only the high priest could enter once a year on the Day of Atonement. And I'll speak of that in a little bit. But some of the Jewish texts say that this curtain was 4 inches thick. And in the second temple, it would have been 75 feet tall, and as many as 300 people just to position it. So you can imagine 300 people working on one curtain. I just want to emphasize just the size of that curtain and the importance of it. And the purple dye that was used in it was very expensive. I think probably most people know that, but I learned that it took about 12,000 snails to make just a gram or two of that dye. So I can't imagine how long it would take to collect the hundreds of thousands of snails it would have taken to make this, but it was probably fairly labor intensive, and again showed the importance of at a time when people just struggle to put food on their plates. I can imagine the amount of effort that went into building this temple shows how important it was at the time. Only the high priest would enter this Holy of Holies one day a year on the Day of Atonement, and it meant that Israel could only enter the presence of God by being represented by this high priest. So that's important to know that the Jews were all represented by the priest in the presence of God, and even inside of this chamber, the high priest, I'll talk about that in a minute. But in this Holy of Holies, it was a perfect cube, and it also was decorated with palm trees and flowers, and the ark was flanked by two large cherubim, and the wings reached both sides of the room. And the high priest that would enter this once a year had to be purified and clean, otherwise he would surely die. And he wasn't actually allowed to see the face of God, as we know from other texts. But this is the room where the Jews are represented, by one priest to see God at the time. Again, this represented the place where God dwells. And this first temple was destroyed in 586 BC. The first temple was. But the second temple, the moment Jesus died, the curtains tore from top to bottom. In Matthew 27:51, we learn that. And this symbolically allowed man to enter the presence of God through that. And I think it's striking. It's in Matthew 27, it's literally the next important thing to Jesus died, and the curtains were tore. And the symbolism is so strong to me that the temple was no longer needed. Jesus had died, and you were able to enter his presence through his grace. So I think that's important. In John 2, so the Jews said to him, "What sign do you show for us doing these things?" And Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." Then the Jews then said, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you will raise it up in 3 days." But he was speaking about the temple of his body. When therefore he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. And Jesus continuously demolished these barriers that symbolize the temple apparatus, probably without even many people knowing exactly what he was talking about at the time, and we brought that up today. The inner curtain was simply the last symbolism of that. And part of Jesus demolishing these barriers to be in the presence of God, in 1 Corinthians 3:16, it says, "Do you not know that you are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in you?" In Ephesians 2:21, "In whom the whole structure, being joined together, grows into a holy temple in the Lord." And in Galatians 3:28 refers to anyone being able to enter the temple of God. "And there is neither Greek nor Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is no male and female, for you are all one in Jesus Christ." And I just think that's very important, in just to know how some of this ties together. I don't know that I'd really given that this much thought. And with that, I'd like to offer anyone that would like to enter the temple of Christ today, if you haven't done so in your life, now is a good time. And therefore, brothers and sisters, since we have confidence to enter the holy places by the blood of Jesus, by the new and living way that he opened for us through the curtain, that is, through his flesh. If there's anyone today that would like to take that opportunity, we would like to offer you, as we stand and sing, to come forward. Thank you.
Zion's